Sure, I'll start. I don't want to stand in the way of the brilliant observations I'm sure will follow. We're in deep doo-doo, man. I mean, we're in the grips of something. I think I'm not sure I can give all the parameters, and I don't want to take too long, but that I think is a very serious problem for the country. I think we're out of touch with reality. I think demagoguery is afoot. I think there's a lot of sophomoric reflections about social problem and organization that has just consumed all the air in the room, and we're boxing as shadows and whatnot. And I'll just give one illustration of this, and I'll stop. There's supposed to be an epidemic of racist police killings of Black people. I don't think that's true. I think that's literally false. I don't think these events that we're observing are even properly classified as racial events. I think the unreflective imputation of racial animus to people who happen to be in one group or another and who find themselves in conflict is a deep problem for our society. I think we're losing our way. But like I say, I'm just the first of many people who will make much more important observations, so I'll desist.
Thanks, Glenn. John Wood?
My feeling is that this is, let me go ahead and say something optimistic to try and counterbalance, I think, some of the justifiable pessimism that people may be feeling this moment. I think that this is a moment of extraordinary opportunity and extraordinary danger. And I think that we can focus on the opportunity in a way that calls forth some things that need to happen. Right now, I think there is this zealous pursuit of an ideological victory in favor of a certain version of social justice, which is calling for the sort of vast condemnation of the white supremacist state. It gives the impression that America is irredeemable because its whiteness is something that imbues it with a certain guilt that can only be removed through a sort of mass atonement and capitulation to a series of demands. My feeling is that America is not a fundamentally racist nation, but that Black America faces problems that are complex and systemic. Both of these things can be true at the same time. And I think that a moment like this is a moment in which the nation is paying greater attention to the plight of Black America. And if that happens in a way to where those energies can be diverted towards sensitive listening and an appreciation of the nuances that govern our reality, then we can make the space for genuine progress to occur. But we have to move past the demagoguery and the demonization that has characterized the conversation so far, and that is so heavily invested in this sort of tribal vilifying of certain groups. If we can get past that, then we can use the attention of the moment to actually break through to something better.
Great. Coleman, you're up.
Yeah, so I think we face many serious problems as a country. Foremost at this moment is the fact that policing is a difficult job. And we have, the way the police are structured often doesn't provide incentives for police to be at their best. We face tricky problems. We face problems that are much harder than I think would be suggested if you listen to the dominant rhetoric coming out of the left-wing activist movement right now. We live in a country with more guns than people, where when police pull someone over, they have to some extent rational fear that the person might have a pistol hidden in the glove compartment. And certain police officers deal with that as well as it could possibly be dealt with, and other police officers are horrible at their jobs. But that's a uniquely American situation because of how much of a gun country we are. It's a situation that there is no pat or easy solution to. And I think I'm more optimistic about the prospect of never seeing a George Floyd or Tony Timpa like incident again, where a cop just has his knee on someone's neck or upper back and essentially kills them in that way. I think it's possible to come to a place where we never see an incident or almost never see an incident like that. I'm not at all optimistic about getting to a place where we never see an unarmed American of any particular race getting shot by a cop. But the problem is, I think, the media has prepared Black people to think of this kind of event as something that only or overwhelmingly happens to Black people, and therefore to react as if our people are being hunted by selectively omitting all the cases where this happens to white people. And I see lots of what seem like purely symbolic fake solutions to these problems being offered. Reparations, how does that help police brutality? Hiring more Black people in C-suite positions at corporations, where's the link between that and fixing broken public schools? So I see lots of fake solutions being offered to real problems, and that worries me because they appear in people's minds to be real solutions.
Great. Thomas?
Hi, yeah. Well, to pick up on where Coleman left off, I actually do think that that some sort of reparations might go a long way towards or healing some of the divisions in our society. I start from the premise that race isn't real, but racism is, and that a specific group of people that have been in this country since the collision of Europe and Africa 400 some odd years ago happened, have been failed by their government in this specific geography, and that a lot of the kind of inequality could be fixed with some type of solution that I don't have right now to go off the top of my head with, but that the idea of reparations might do something towards helping racial division. I also think from where I sit in Europe, just looking back at America, it's extraordinary once you leave to realize how violent a society it is and how extraordinarily violent the police are towards all American citizens compared to other wealthy societies. So the police kill upwards of 1,000 people a year. Over 500 of those 1,000 will be white. 10 out of every million of those 1,000 will be Native American. It's the proportion is 6 out of a million for blacks, 2.2 out of a million for whites, and Asians are very rarely killed by police. So there is a problem, and whites get the bulk of the numbers, but blacks are disproportionately killed, but not in the worst situation compared to Native Americans. You can imagine a situation where a widespread call for policing reform should be something that all American citizens are invested in. And so I think that part of the rhetoric, as has already been said here, part of the rhetoric that this is a uniquely or specifically Black problem does more to hinder a lasting and important solution than trying to find common ground and common problems to deal with.
Excellent. John McWhorter?
I think what we're seeing right now at this moment is that a certain radical strain of anti-racism that's been present for a long time. It's been present for decades. It's intellectually mediocre, but it's extremely frightening to other people because one of its main tenets is that to not agree with it makes you a racist. So we're in a society where to be called a racist is essentially equivalent to being called a pedophile. And you have this minority of people with this frankly half-cocked notion of how we should deal with race in the society that entails burning everything down and starting again, policing language in a way that would make it impossible to say anything. The whole philosophy is based on paradoxes that don't make any sense. It's all quite a mess, but there's always been a certain kind of person, many of them white, many of them Black, who subscribe to this, where because of what happened to George Floyd and the response to it, which I think was conditioned actually somewhat fortuitously by how everybody has been feeling after quarantine. And it's been a really interesting series of happenstances. Because of that space, I think that these new anti-racists sense this as a moment when they can actually take over. They sense it as a useful time when they can make America believe what they believe. Now, I don't want to make it sound like they're evil. Most people like that are very nice people who sincerely believe that what they're thinking is correct, because frankly, a lot of them have been trained not to think very hard about race. It's all very intellectually mediocre, but they're not going to let go of it. And so the point that we're at right now is that these people are threatening to tear down any institution that matters and create this kind of Orwellian America. They don't know the evil that they're doing. They're not evil people. They don't understand that their ideas won't work. But it is the time for all good men and women and humans to face this mob down. And that hasn't been happening before. Generally, the ordinary person who knows that all of that stuff is nonsense goes along with it because they want to keep their job and they have kids to raise. They have bigger fish to fry. It's completely understandable. But that's not going to work this time. And so I'm wondering whether the ordinary person who knows that all of that stuff is a new kind of Stalinism is going to have it in them to start saying no. They might not, in which case I really do fear for what's going to happen. On the other hand, I see signs that they might. There might be a way of keeping this from going any further than it already has. I'd like to see what happens this calendar year as we go into the fall. How many people are going to be capable of standing up to this sort of thing? Because after a few people did, after a few organizations did, then there would be a copycat phenomenon. Once people start to see that the sky won't fall in, if somebody says, you're a racist, and you just stand there and say, okay, once they realize that the world will keep spinning, that'll start happening more. I hope it does.
All right. Chloe?
So I would say, to piggyback on what has already been said, that for me, this looks like a crisis of meaning in the country. So I think that we are, as citizens, increasingly atomized and isolated, both socially, certainly due to COVID-19, but we've been isolated prior to that. And I also think that there's a spiritual malnourishment in the country that manifests itself in certain ways, one of which is racially. I think that the way in which this idea of anti-racism has been proliferating over the past few months is a direct product of that spiritual malnourishment. And so without addressing that issue, we will continue to have these issues pop up every so often. And I agree that this will be able to be sort of kept at bay if the average person is able to stand up for themselves and say no. But I'm not sure if the average person actually has that fortitude and that confidence to do so. I will say that I have been approached specifically because of Theory of Enchantment and the way it actually teaches texts by a lot of the traditional African-American scholars of, the Harlem Renaissance movement and such. I have been approached by people looking for alternatives to some of the anti-racist programming that's been promoted by Ibram Kendi in the workplace and in corporations and in schools. I have been approached by people, so in the name of diversity and inclusion, asking me for an alternative through the Theory of Enchantment lens. So that is very, I think, hopeful, just to see that people are actually looking for alternatives. And it's possible that the rise of folks like Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo is actually going to be short-lived. I don't know, we shall see. But I also think, on a more hopeful sort of point, that the people writ large, the American people, in the same way that we are susceptible to being sort of whipped into a frenzy by the media and susceptible to being polarized and sort of turning against each other, again, because of that spiritual malnourishment, because we gravitate toward politics as a form of religion now, I think we are also I've seen encouraging signs that we're also tired of a lot of this being whipped into a frenzy and tired of, tearing each other apart at the seams, and are really hungry for something that would actually be unifying and bring us together. So I think that is cause for great hope.
Great. Camille?
I do like batting cleanup in a situation like this because so many great things have already been said. And while there are some disagreement in a couple of specific places. I think I am in broad agreement with the general theme. I will say that I think it's important to pay some attention to the context we find ourselves in. I mean, the country is in a very vulnerable position. We've just had, actually are still in the throes of a global pandemic. We're at the very beginning, I think, of a pretty profound economic crisis that might play out over the course of the next decade. And the specific manifestations of concern, like the waves of it, the paroxysms of it, are important. But interestingly, I don't know that race is so central to it. It's a piece of this conversation, but it isn't all of it. Just as policing is a piece of the conversation, but it isn't all of it. We've seen ourselves sort of careen from a place where people are particularly concerned about an imagined genocide against all Black people, to tearing down statues and monuments, to reallocation of wealth, to the inculcation of these new ideas, like the notion that individuality itself is somehow a retrograde notion that should be condemned, and that we should be instituting new corrective curriculums in our workplaces and in our schools to try and introduce new ways of thinking. A lot of those tendencies, the interest in sort of re-education and realignment, it'd be one thing if they were happening under normal circumstances. I think the fact that they're happening under these extraordinary circumstances makes the circumstance all the more disconcerting. So I do think it's important to have these conversations about race and identity. I think it's important to engage on conversations about structural racism and, yes, historic injustices that have perpetuated certain kinds of inequality. But I also think it's important not to lose sight of that broader context and the degree to which rectifying any one of those problems probably doesn't get us out of the bind that we find ourselves in.